Today we are talking about the former prophets. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. If you have not previously heard of the former prophets, it's because these are among what in the English, the usual English breakdown, are called the historical books. But there's a problem with that. I'm using the Hebrew designation of former prophets. And the problem with it is several things. One, there's a problem when we think about history in terms of the Old Testament. Remember now that the last of the Old Testament was written in the mid-400s. Okay, that was the book of Malachi. Christian systems call these historical books, when in fact history, as we understand history, was not invented at that time. In those days, and here, as I say, our usual definition of history would be something like a continuous systematic narrative of past events, usually written as a chronological account. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, and it's assumed that it's with some objectivity, that the writer is neutral. He's just trying to report the facts. It's sort of like journalism, supposedly.
Please.
But in fact, history was not invented as we understand history until the 400s in Greece, 400s BC, around the same time that the very last book of the Old Testament was written. Herodotus, in writing the account of the Persian Wars, the war between Persia and Greece, and I say Greece, it was actually city-states, Athens, Sparta, etc. And then later on, Thucydides, who wrote the Peloponnesian Chronicle of the Peloponnesian War, which is between Sparta and Athens, those were the two men who were responsible for inventing Greek history as we understand it. The idea of chronological, objective reporting of events. Prior to that, all of what goes as history was primarily written by whoever the victors were in order to represent their glory. And a good example, which I consider the first example of political spin in history, was that when the Assyrians, after having conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, they came down to the southern kingdom of Judah and were parked outside the gates, and God sent a plague and killed so many of them that the king, Sennacherib, ended up going back to Assyria without having actually conquered Jerusalem. Well, he then writes in his chronicles of all the kings that he defeated and all the lands he conquered, and the king of Jerusalem I pinned up inside his city like a bird in a cage. That's the best he could say. He didn't actually defeat him. It was Hezekiah at that point, was the king of Judea, the king in Jerusalem. And so you didn't expect those kinds of writings to be neutral. They were expected to be biased in favor of whoever won, and they weren't chronological. See, we run into that problem because the Jews still maintain that as a pattern. And in the Gospels, they don't line up exactly. The first three, the Synoptic Gospels, for instance, because their approach was that you sometimes would put things together if you felt like the content, the events were relevant, even if they happened a great distance apart. It wasn't a chronology as we understand it. So with Herodotus inventing modern history, he's called the father of history. At the same time, the very last of the books of the Old Testament were written. You can see the problem with us to try to think of history as we understand history being applied to the Old Testament. That's why I think it makes much more sense for us to use the Hebrew or Jewish reference to this part of the Jewish Tanakh and call them the former prophets rather than the historical books, because we confuse ourselves when we call them historical books. Now, they do account historical events, but they don't do so in exactly the way we would expect. It's much more appropriate to call them the former prophets, that is, the earlier prophets. And prophecy, as we say here, is what it literally means is speaking or writing by divine inspiration. To speak the words that God wants his people to hear is what prophecy means. It doesn't mean telling the future. And so for these to be prophets, it meant to report what God wanted to have reported, and they were the earlier ones, and so they're called the former prophets. And again, the last paragraph here, while they do record historical events, their purpose is not to write history per se, but rather to record God's actions in fulfilling his covenant promises. God had promised to do certain things. These books are about how God fulfills those promises. So the issue is really God's action in fulfillment of his promises more than it is a chronological record of events. Make sense? So you always get into trouble if you start thinking of the Old Testament as history in the sense of history as we know it. And people will say, oh, you know, that stuff, you can't, that's not history. Well, it shouldn't be claimed to be history, per se, all right? So, the books that we're talking about, the first of them, it's the first book after the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses, is the book of Joshua. Traditionally, it is written by Joshua. Joshua, who was who was the primary assistant to Moses. He was one of the spies that went into the land. He and Caleb were the two spies that said, we believe we can take this land by God's power, and the other 10 spies said, no, we can't. And it was for that lack of faith that they wandered in the desert for 40 years until the whole generation of men had died, with the exception of Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, the three who believed. We believe it was written about 1405 to 1390 BC, and that's the period of time immediately following the wilderness wanderings, which would have been in the last half of the 15th century BC, or between 1450 and 1400. The theme, straightforward, it's the conquest of the Promised Land, and then the assigning and settling of the tribes of Israel throughout the land. Joshua, of course, was the military leader who led the people to conquer the land that was occupied by other peoples, the land that God had promised to give them as part of his covenant promise. Again, God had promised Abraham several things. One, I will make of you a great nation, even though he was an old man and didn't have any children. Secondly, I will give you a land for your people to live on that will be their own. And third, just a blue black. The land, the people,
bless all the people.
And I will bless all the people of the world through you. That was the third one. Thank you. And then he repeated that again to Isaac and to Jacob, the son and grandson of Abraham. So this is the fulfillment of one of the aspects of those promises, and that is giving of the land to the people of Israel. The purpose is to show that God is faithful to keep his covenant promises, and that really is God's faithfulness, and the unfaithfulness of the people is the Israelites really is the theme of all of the former prophets. And we get into the latter prophets, as well. But primarily the fact that God is acting very intentionally and very specifically in fulfilling the promise of giving them the land. There's three major sections to the book of Joshua. First is the campaign to capture Canaan. When they march into the land of Canaan, the first city they come to is Jericho. One of my favorite stories in all of Scripture is when and we've talked about it with regard to the process of building this church. Any act of faith on the part of Christians, I think that this story is relevant. The Israelites were told by God through Joshua, gather yourselves according to your tribes on the east side of the Jordan River, and the Jordan was a pretty major river, and get ready to cross. And at a certain point, God tells Joshua to have the priests pick up the Ark of the Covenant and walk into the water until their feet are wet. I'm sure when they're all lining up getting ready to cross, the people are going, there's no bridge, there's no boats. How is this going to work? When Joshua, being in charge, demonstrated his faith that God knew what he was doing when he said, get ready to cross, when the priests walked into the water and got their feet wet, the River Jordan was rolled back, and the people were able to cross on dry land. This is a very clear echo of the crossing of the Red Sea, and in that way an affirmation of Joshua's leadership. God anointing Joshua as leader at this point. There could be no question, because the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea under Moses was echoed in the parting of the River Jordan when they crossed over into the land. And of course, then the first city they came to was Jericho. The second section is the distribution of the land, how they divided it up amongst the 12 tribes, because each tribe would be given their own area that they would be responsible for, and it was a covenant pledge. They were not allowed to sell that land outside their family. And this is one of the reasons that we had every 7 years, all of the land had to return back to who owned it. So in effect, you were only renting and leasing it for 1 to 7 years. The reason for that is because this was part of God's promise, and you couldn't just sell it away. It had to remain with the Israelites, and it had to remain specifically with the different tribes that had been assigned this. So the second section, chapters 13 to 21, is where the land is distributed according to God's instructions. And then the final section is sort of closing out. There is the debt of the tribes to God, their acknowledgement that God has made this possible, and then the return of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. They had asked, before they ever crossed the Jordan River, they had said, when everything's done, can we settle over here? The Transjordan, it was called, on the east side of the river, whereas everybody else was going to go to the west. And the agreement was, yes, you can do that, but first you have to help us conquer the land. Once we've done that, then you can go live over here. And there's this fascinating story where they built this altar of stone as an acknowledgement of God's presence with them, and remember, so that they would never forget that even though these other three tribes were separated, they're all part of one. And the other tribes almost went to war with them because they thought they were getting ready to worship in a different place than Shiloh, which is where God had said to worship for that time. And then there is Joshua's farewell speech. Okay?
Did the families and the herds and all that stuff stay on the other side, and only the soldiers go over of those 2.5 tribes?
I would have to look at it and see. I don't remember off the top of my head what the details were there. Whether the families and, whatnot stayed on the side. It took them a while to conquer, so the likelihood is that they probably did cross over with them and then return with them, because this didn't happen overnight.
But this land was already conquered?
Well, they had already marched through it. And I'll show you some maps in a few minutes and you can see the route. But they had already marched up through Edom and Moab and got ready to cross over. So they had already been victorious in that area, although that was not technically part of the Promised Land.
So they had to go around. Which one did they have to go around? They couldn't go through?
Well, we'll look at it in a minute.
Okay.
There was, they were having trouble with Edom, which is the descendants of Esau, sneaking up behind him. And, the people were a little bit slower. They were picking people off as they traveled through, and they ended up getting judged for that pretty harshly. So, this is how the book of Joshua opens. First 9 verses. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, you remember that Moses was not allowed to enter the Promised Land, but God allowed him to go up on Mount Ebal, which was a tall mountain just on the east side of the Jordan, so that he could look out and see the Promised Land. And then he died and was buried. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to you, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea and the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Obviously, God was really wanting to emphasize the be strong and courageous thing. And Joshua was. But you will notice the description of the land here, that it's supposed to go from the desert in the south, that's the Negev desert, up to Lebanon in the north, so we're talking the whole east end of the Mediterranean Sea, to the Mediterranean, from the river Euphrates, which is over in what we know of as Iraq, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Israel has never occupied all that land. They have, and there are reasons that we find out about. They basically got to a certain point and said, that's enough. Even though God had told them they should take all of it. And that was a matter of some concern as well as we went along. So let's look at a couple of maps here. This, Moses dies on Mount Ebal, right there, where he could look over onto the Promised Land. Then Joshua takes over. The Israelites prepare to enter the land. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is the Jordan River that flows from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea, as it was called in those days. All of this area here is what we know of as Israel. Okay? The area on the east side of the Jordan River is the Transjordan, it's called. And that's where the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they wanted to live over here.
But so that was still part of what was originally
It was what was originally promised.
That, I never realized
Yeah.
that before.
Because the Euphrates River is, way over here. All the way from there to the Mediterranean, from the Negev Desert down here all the way up to Lebanon, which would be, there. They've never occupied all that land.
So, okay, I've got this part, but from where to where over here?
Well, it would have been, the Euphrates River would have been over here. In fact,
Is the Tigris here and the Euphrates
no,
there, or vice versa?
the Persian Gulf would be somewhere over here, okay? And then the Tigris and the Euphrates are a fork that's split off of that. But the Tigris and Euphrates would be over here somewhere, quite a distance out of this map. All right? You hear Mesopotamia is talked about all the time. That was where civilization began. Mesopotamia literally means the land between the rivers, and it means between the Tigris and the Euphrates. All right? So all of this was supposed to be the promised land, but they ended up stopping short and not gaining all of it.
Would the Garden of Eden be anywhere in that area?
Well, there's a lot of controversy about that. I think we talked about that a little bit in one of the previous weeks. It's supposed to be watered by 3 rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and a third one. And so people have projected that it's somewhere up in the highlands, up, northwest of, the Persian Gulf where the rivers come. But research has been done fairly recently saying that here in Canaan, or Palestine, or the Promised Land, whatever you want to call it, that, and they've discovered this because of satellite imagery. They use satellite imagery now to be able to determine where minerals might be because they're able to do they've figured out that there are a lot of ancient riverbeds that are sold, that they're not evident from the surface now, but they're able to see them from above. And there are tributaries to the Tigris and Euphrates, which could have been called part of those rivers, that come over here into Canaan, into Palestine. So it's very possible that somewhere in what we know of as the Holy Land, that could have been the site of the Garden of Eden, and that at that point it was watered by, the rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, etc. So we don't know. I mean, that's the long answer, is we don't know for sure.
But traditionally, it's like in Iran, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, they believe northwestern Iran.
I had always heard that it was, more south in Iran. But
Well, it'd have to be someplace that was benefited both by the Tigris and Euphrates, and the further apart they get, the wider it is. So we don't know. This is what Canaan looked like at the time of conquest. There were, just a pack and a bushel full of ites in this area. Down in the south, we have Midianites, Edomites, who were the descendants of Esau, Amalekites, Moabites, Ammonites, Amorites, more Amorites up here, the Amorites got around, Hittites, Girgasites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Canaanites here, Philistines, they don't have ites. You get the idea. This whole area was called, we call it Palestine. It wasn't called Palestine at this time. It was not called Palestine until after the Romans took it over. And they called it Palestine as sort of a perversion of the name Philistine. That's where the name Palestine comes from. So it wasn't called Palestine back then when it was introduced as the Promised Land. They called it Canaan, the land of Canaan. And again, this outline here is the Dead Sea, or what was called the Salt Sea back then, the Sea of Galilee, or the Chinnereth Sea. Bless you. And then the River Jordan connecting the two. And then lots of tributaries coming into that. So this tells you how they got there. The pink arrows are the progress that they made. They came up the wilderness of Zin down here, which is part of the Negev and going into the Arabian desert. That was where they wandered, and then when they came up, they still wandered around some. They passed around Moab, that's what you were talking about. Passed around Moab because the Moabites would not let them come through there, and then Here, they're in the territory of the Amorites. This is Ammon over here. And this is, I'm losing my track. The Mount Nebo is right there, Nebo, right there, Mount Nebo. That's where Moses is buried somewhere. From here, they cross the Jordan River. Okay, this is the Jordan River, not very clearly marked on here. And the first city they come to is Jericho. And of course, the Battle of Jericho, where they walked around it, carrying the Ark of the Covenant for 7 days, 6 days, and on the seventh day they blew their horns and the walls fell. From there, they had, later on they came up further north here on the Transjordan side, but they turned south from Jericho and ended up fighting battles to take over the southern and central areas of the land of Canaan. Then they turned and went north, and the battle of the waters of Merom here, they conquered the northern peoples and ended up sort of spreading out this way. But they never did get over here where, as far as they were promised. All right? Questions about that? Yes?
Why?
Well, trying to be sympathetic to them, after a while you get tired of fighting, you know? I can sort of understand that part of it. But part of it was a lack of faith, too. They had already started being influenced by some of the peoples that were there. One of the things that happened is God had, of course, told them to either destroy or drive the people out of the land, because God knew what the negative influence the people would be on them, that they would intermarry with them, which they weren't supposed to do. They would begin to worship their gods, which they weren't supposed to do. And as we've said before, worshiping some of the Canaanite gods was a pretty horrendous thing. It involved child sacrifice in many cases. Molech, Dagon, some of the other of the gods, the Baals. And God knows better than us, and He knew that that was going to be a huge problem unless the people were completely driven out or were completely destroyed. And I know people say, well, you know, how can there be a good and loving God who does that? Well, there's also a completely wise and just God in there who knows that sometimes very difficult things are necessary, because down the road consequences can be even more horrendous than that, and that ended up being the case. After a while, when he told them to drive out all of the Canaanites, they decided better to keep them as slave labor rather than kill them or drive them off. And so they were trying to make their own lives easier, even though it was not what God told them to do. You know, he didn't tell them to take slaves. He told them to drive them off, or in some cases kill them, and they didn't obey. They had less faith in God and more faith in their own comfort. So, yes?
Would that covenant to the Jewish people still apply today for that territory?
Well, this is the place where it outlines what the Promised Land is supposed to be. So yes, you know, it's not modern Israel. We'll look at a map in a minute about what Israel was under David and Solomon, okay, which is bigger than what we think of as Israel, but still not nearly everything that had been promised. And so, because that's the time, you know, that's the period in which Israel was at its height in terms of a political power and influence and wealth under David, and even especially under Solomon. A lot of people hearken back to that as the goal, even though, again, the outline of what's supposed to be the Promised Land, according to Joshua, is more than that. Okay? So, this is the movement. The initial appeal to prepare to take the land in the first 5 chapters, the conquest of the land in 7 chapters, the distribution of the land in 7 chapters, and then the closing appeal, living in the land, what it was that they were to do once they got there. This is what the distribution of the land looked like. Again, at this point, they're down into the Negev desert, the wilderness of the Kadesh Barnea was where they met before they actually moved north, and they got back down as far as that. The pink, the largest one, is Judah. This is Benjamin here. And those were the 2 tribes that later on were primarily the southern kingdom. Then you'll notice the different colors up here. Each one of them, according to this chart, represents the location that was divided out amongst the tribes. The only tribe that did not get an allotment of land in the distribution were the Levites. They were the priestly tribe. They're the Cohenites as we know them today. If you know or have ever met anybody named Cohen, Leonard Cohen just died.
Yeah.
Okay, a musician. The fact that he has the name Cohen means we know he was a descendant of the Levites, and they've proven that genetically. That the name Cohen carries the genetic markers for the Levite tribe. So the Levites were not given a large section of land. They were given areas to graze some animals outside the cities where they were located, but their income, their sustenance was not supposed to come from owning land and planting crops and running herds as much as it was from caring for the temple and receiving a portion of what everybody else produced. Okay? And so you won't see the Levites on this list anywhere. Yes?
Okay, so I blanked for a minute. So God distributed this land, and they took their places. So later on, why were some so poor? It seemed like he distributed so everybody would have a good chance.
Well, a lot of them were disobedient. And one of the things, like the tribe of Dan, I hope I'm getting this right, they coveted another piece of land. And so they went and just took it away from the people who were there and did not accept the allotment that was given to them. Well, God did not bless them in that. They ended up with all kinds of problems. The tribe of Benjamin was, they produced some pretty good people later, and Paul was in the tribe of Benjamin, for instance, but they committed an atrocity against the concubine of a traveler and ended up being judged for that. And we're not supposed to have any wives. And then people were disobedient. When they conquered a city, they took 400 young women who had never been married and gave them to the Benjamites because they were worried about the fact that this tribe is going to die out if they're not allowed to have any wives. And that was against God's instructions. So there was a lot of reasons why God would not have blessed their activities. Okay? But you get the idea that all of this, and again, they were not allowed to sell to a non-Jew, and if they sold to a non-Jew who was not of their family, then 7 years later it would come back to them. So all you ever did was lease it. You never really bought property, you could only lease it. Right? Because in 7 years it all had to return. So, book of Joshua, conquering and distributing the land. And it's in Joshua that we begin to see just how quick the Israelites were to be disobedient to God. They were tired of fighting, they wanted to settle down, they wanted more luxury, and so they started being disobedient in various ways. And they did not control all of what was promised to them because of that. In fact, later on, we've talked about this before, the land of milk and honey. You see pictures from Jerusalem. This area, I know the Jordan River, you think of a river as being a low point, but actually this is a ridge that runs, and it drops down from there to the Mediterranean and then down into the desert over here. Well, the ridge, like mountains tend to be, is rocky and is very dry, other than right along, sort of like the Nile River, other than right along the Jordan River, or up in Galilee. But the part that was rich down in here was some of the parts that they never took. And that they stopped short. And so some of what they'd been promised they didn't get because the best of it they weren't willing to make the effort to take as they'd been instructed to. Nobody ever said it was going to be easy, just that it was going to be successful if they were obedient to God. But they weren't.
Approximately how long did it take them to conquer what they did?
I ought to know the answer to that question. About 40 years is what comes into my mind. About a generation. All right?
While they were down in Egypt, when the people, when Moses said to God at the burning bush, well, who do I tell them you are? Suggesting they that the people were probably worshippers of the Egyptian gods.
Probably. I mean, they did. The Jewish religion did not exist before God gave Moses the law on Mount Sinai. The only thing they had been given was Abraham. All these were descendants of Abraham. Abraham and his descendants would be God's people, and God would be their God. There were no rules to follow. There were no instructions as to how to do this. There were no worship guidelines. There was nothing. And so it's very hard to believe that they could have maintained a focus when they didn't have anything more specific than that. Circumcision was the only thing that they really had in terms of a mark of being a Jew. And that's why I think that when they, I've said this before, when they got to the foot of Mount Sinai and Moses was gone so long, and they got Aaron, they twisted Aaron's arm a little bit, got him to make them a golden calf. Well, one of the most beloved of the Egyptian deities was Horus, who takes the form of a calf, actually, the face of a woman with cow ears and stuff, and was seen as the goddess of family and fertility and all things good. Well, it makes sense that they've been 400 years in Egypt, the last part of it, captivity, that when they needed reassurance, they would have fallen back on the gods they had known in Egypt. And so that's why the golden calf, I think. So, this is the book of Joshua. Pretty straightforward. We then come to the next book of the former prophets, which is the book of Judges. Judges in this case does not mean, black robes and gavel. I find you guilty of whatever. A judge in that time was one who was the authority figure for everything. Politics, law, Deborah, for instance, one of the judges, sat under the tree and sort of dispensed justice, dispensed fairness to the people. So they did look to them for that. But more than anything else, they were military leaders that provide leadership in the absence of other leadership. They were especially anointed by God. We don't know for sure who wrote the book of Judges. We believe it may have been Samuel, the prophet, who was technically considered the last of the judges. He's not usually on that list, but he's the last of the anointed of God that provided leadership before they went into the monarchy. Okay, because we go through, from the time of Moses' leadership to the time of Joshua's leadership to the time of the judges, and then immediately after that we go into the monarchy where they have kings. And so Samson is the one that's the bridge, or Samson was one of the judges, but Samuel, the priest, prophet, was the one who bridged between the judges and the monarchy. He's the one that God sent to anoint the new king when the Israelites insisted on having a king. But he is considered the last of the judges, and the one who led into the time of monarchy. Okay? We believe, again, it's the next period after, somewhere around 1380 to 1045 BC. And the theme is God's provision. Even despite the unfaithfulness of the Israelites in so many ways, and the fact that they didn't prosper as they should have, they didn't get all of the promised land because they were unwilling to be obedient. They were doing stuff God told them not to do. Still, God makes provision for them to take care of their needs, because at this point, because they've been disobedient, they start getting attacked by some of these people that still exist, some of whom they were supposed to have killed or driven off. They didn't, and so these people started attacking them. And they ended up being attacked in all sorts of different areas from different tribes. The Ammonites, Moabites, others are after them during this time. And the book is seen as having the purpose of clearly demonstrating that the Israelites need God. And if they're not obedient to God, bad things are going to happen. The outline is first, the first chapter is the failure to complete the conquest. The first chapter of Judges is the one that says they didn't do what they were supposed to do. They got lazy, they got, they didn't really trust God. They thought they had a better idea about how they ought to do this, including taking slaves instead of driving the people off. There was a judgment of God against them in terms of people coming in, the nations that came in and started attacking them. It was by God's, God is the God of all nations. And He used those nations surrounding them to bring judgment against them. And then there is the deliverance of Israel. In various locations throughout the Promised Land, God called up these leaders, and they were, again, primarily military leaders, but they also dispensed justice, they were political leaders, etc. In the southern part, the first names that we hear, and some of these we know nothing more about them other than that they were the name and that they were a judge. Some of them we have longer stories about. People like Gideon and Deborah, for instance, Deborah and Barak, we know more detail about. But in the southern part, we first hear about the Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar are called up to represent God and to lead the fight against the people that are threatening the Israelites. Then we jump to the northern part of the kingdom, and we have Deborah and Barak. And Deborah was one of the best known and most important of all the judges as a woman. So we have a woman in charge connected to Barak. That's kind of weird. I hadn't thought about it that way before. And then, so from the north, we then go to the center. Remember, they really did, when they conquered the Promised Land, they had 3 campaigns: Southern Campaign, Central Campaign, and Northern Campaign. So when we're introduced to the judges, they're given to us in terms of those different areas. The center would be Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, and Jair. And then the eastern part, which would be closer to the Jordan River, and on the east side of the Jordan River, was Jephthah. Then there's a second northern campaign led by Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And then the western campaign against the Philistines is led by Samson. Now, you remember Philistia? So the western campaign right along the coastline was the Philistines still control that, and of course the Philistines were the one that Samson fought against, and even when he finally allowed himself to be seduced and had his hair cut and lost his strength in disobedience, his last act, he prayed for God to give him strength to push out the pillars and to bring the temple down, the temple of Dagon, down on top of the Philistines. And that was his last act. So that's why, being in the west, that's where Philistia was. We then have the depravity of Israel, which is just a declaration of all the awful things they were doing and how they were following other gods and how they were intermarrying with other groups, etc. Despite the fact that God kept sending these judges to different places who would provide military leadership and instruction and justice and all of that, ultimately, and they'd be fine for a little while, and then they'd forget about that and they'd go back to worshiping other gods and marrying other women and that sort of thing. So that's the depravity of Israel. Let me give you some verses here now about judges. In chapter 2, verse 10 to 15, we get sort of the statement about what's going on generally. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, that is, all of those that had first entered the Promised Land, right? Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals, or Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger. Because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths, that was one of the other gods, the Asherah poles they talk about. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Continue. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their ancestors, they quickly turned from following the way of their ancestors, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So this is the setting for the book of Judges. And this is where the judges were located. In the south, Othniel, Samson, Ibzan, well, sort of west Samson, that's Philistia. Ehud, Abdon, Tola, Jephthah, Gideon, Jair, Deborah, Elon, and Shamgar. Again, some of them we know nothing more than their name and that they were called up by God to be a judge to fulfill those things we were just talking about. Others we know quite a bit more about, like Gideon and Deborah. All right? Questions about the judges? This is just a survey. We're just skipping over, as always. 8 weeks to cover the whole Old Testament. Any questions? Make sense? Yes?
So then the judges were considered the leaders before we got David as the king.
Right.
Solomon as the king.
They were sort of local leaders.
Okay.
Sort of think of them as like governor figures, except God used them to militarily fight back against the raiders, you know, in God's mercy, even though the Israelites weren't particularly deserving it. As long as the judges were alive, the people listened to them and did what they said. And as soon as the judges died, they went back to their old ways. So there was no long-term recollection of what they ought to be or how they ought to act. But yeah, none of them were kings. They were simply sort of magistrates over the military, the political, and the religious for the time and for the area where they were located.
Well, but so, in the first generation, obviously, weren't the Levites supposed to teach the people? They're part of their, so the second generation comes along and they don't know about God and they don't care about God.
Right?
So that must mean that they didn't talk to their children.
Well, it was difficult in those days because they had not conquered Jerusalem yet. There was no temple. They were worshiping at Shiloh. Okay, that's the reason that the 10 tribes got so, including the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh that was on the western area. They got mad at Reuben, Gad, and the other half-tribe of Manasseh because they put up this altar, because they thought, you're not agreeing to worship where God told us to worship, which was Shiloh. Well, you know, the people are spread out, and even though it's not a very big country, still, if you're living up here, and Shiloh is quite a long way away from that. And so the tendency to not stay connected with your own religion, your own faith for the children, and again, they were still fighting battles. They had planting and harvesting to do. Just life was harder then. They had less time for study, and so it's kind of a natural thing. I'm not excusing it because God had been very clear in His instructions, but they just allowed everything else to kind of occupy them, and they didn't proceed with the faith because they didn't have a church on every corner. You know, the one location they were told they were to go and have sacrifice and to worship the Lord their God was in Shiloh, and that was a long way away from most of them. Okay. Later on, of course, there was the temple, and that's why the law said that Jewish men had to come to the temple at least 4 times a year. It's recommended they come more often, but there were 4 major festivals that they were supposed to attend. Passover being the most important one. And even then, they didn't all go. Later on, when the temple was destroyed, they ended up creating the synagogue system, which was really beneficial to the extent that every community could have its own place of prayer and study, to study the law, to teach the children, and also as community center. But at this time, there's only one place, and they were pretty spread out. Yes?
However, they did have Levites scattered throughout the areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so they must have fell down on their jobs too.
Well, yeah, and even though the Levites were a full tribe, there were only so many of them that were assigned to regular priestly duties. It's not like they had 20,000 Levites out of, because some of the tribes were really large. Mm-hmm. And they were all busy all the time because they're only working in one place. And you'll notice there are places, even in the Gospels, Elizabeth's husband is called, Zechariah is called for his time of duty.
Yeah.
They would have to schedule them for only certain periods of time because they had more people who were qualified or supposed to be doing priestly duty than, so it's like only every once in a while would they be on assignment. And when they only had the location and all the people scattered out and still fighting battles and everything else, probably even less attention to that. So
maybe I'm mistaken the idea that they were supposed to be teaching the people the laws and all that stuff.
yeah, well,
Where they were, but maybe, I don't know, maybe that's just my idea.
well, apparently they didn't. That wasn't part of it because they were located with the tabernacle. Then they were located at, the altar at Shiloh, and then later on they were at the temple. But they didn't have satellites. It's not like they would go out into the communities. They weren't itinerant. They didn't have churches and other synagogues or anything else in other places for a long time, not until the temple itself was destroyed. So there really was no mechanism for the people to get regular education. And that's why down through the history when we get into the monarchs and stuff, they apparently lost the law because under Josiah they refound it. So yeah, it was not a clear organization, even though God had given instructions. They hadn't quite figured out how to implement all that yet. Yes?
Any indication of the size of the population at that time?
Well, we were told that when the Israelites left Egypt, it says there were 650,000 of them, you know, and scholars really question that, whether they added a zero or whatever, but however many, you know, they once they got there, they had scattered out, but that's the only real indication we have, is he said 650,000, the scripture says.
For that amount and that huge area that God told him to take over, I mean, that would have made him quite thin, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, and that's why the tribes were concentrated in certain areas, and certain tribes were much larger. Judah by far being the biggest, and some of them, Naphtali, for instance, very small, and so that's why they have different sized territories. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why they didn't follow through. Okay, let's look at the next book in the form of prophets, which is the book of 1 Samuel. I just mentioned to you, and this is traditionally written by the prophet Samuel. Samuel was the one who was the transition between the period of the judges and the period of the monarchy. We believe it was written sometime around 930 BC or later. And it's the transition from theocracy under the judges to monarchy under the kings, and how all that happened. God uses the prophet Samuel, who is truly one of the great men of Scripture. Samuel, I don't think gets enough credit with most people. He was a truly significant man of God, you know, that God used in many ways. But God uses the prophet Samuel to give people the king that they want, Saul. But then Saul fails, and it leads to David being king. So the outline of the book is, first, you get Samuel, the priest of God, the last of the judges, the prophet of God, and for the first 8 chapters. And then you get from chapter 9 to 15, the first king, Saul. Now, God told the people, you don't need a king. You got me. And the people said, no, 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 everybody else has a king. We want a king. We want somebody to lead us. And God finally gave in and said, okay. And Samuel was sent to select Saul, who apparently was, you know, really tall and strong and handsome and a leader, and everything seemed great. And then after a number of years, he completely messed up and ended up dying in battle because God had taken his blessing away from him. He ended up calling on spirits to try to figure out whether or not he's going to win battles, so he really went the wrong direction in a lot of different ways. And then, after Saul had clearly demonstrated to God that he was not who God wanted him to be, God had Samuel go and find the children of Jethro to anoint one of the sons. And you know the story that he goes to the home of Jethro. God had sent him there, and he said, I need to meet your sons. And he met all of the sons, and none of them, God did not speak to him that any of them were the right one. And he goes, oh, these are all of them? And he goes, well, we've got the little one. You know, the youngest, he's out taking care of the herds. And he goes, we'll call him in. And that was David. And David was the one that Samuel anointed as being the chosen one of God to replace Saul. Now, it was a long time after the selection and anointing of David before Saul ends up being killed. You know, we have the whole battle against the Philistines and about Goliath, the giant that David slays. David is called in to play the harp because he was a musician as well, to play the harp for Saul because he used to get, you know, he had nervous problems or whatever, and that would calm him down. And then Saul started getting jealous of David, and there was that whole conflict. So it was very complicated. It was a long time between when David, as almost still a child, probably mid-teens, was anointed that he would be king, and then when he actually became king. And during all that time, Saul was still in charge. Okay?
I wonder when Saul called David in to calm him down with the music. David had already been anointed by Samuel at that time. Well, did Saul know that?
No.
Okay.
He was not aware of it. His jealousy against David later on was not because that he knew David had been anointed, but because David became such a hero. You know, in the battle against the Philistines, later on, they come back into town in sort of a triumphal march back into Jerusalem, and people are cheering for them, and they cheer, they say, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul immediately realizes that people think better of David than he does him, and the devil's working on him, and he gets horrendously jealous. And it's primarily because of that military stature that David had, more than anything else. Not because he knew that he'd been anointed.
Well, so Samuel didn't tell Saul, I've already anointed somebody.
No, because God told Samuel, I have taken my blessing off of Saul, and I want you to go and find the next king, the one that will replace him. And so God didn't tell Samuel to tell Saul that he had done that, and so he didn't. Let me give you a couple of verses, and then we will take a break. 1 Samuel 8, after the Israelites were saying, give us a king, give us a king. When they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. And Samuel tries to tell the people, he's going to draft your sons to fight wars for him. He's going to take part of your animals as his own. He's going to tax you. Kings are not all sweetness and light like you think they are. Okay? And the people wouldn't listen to them. They wanted a king. Everybody else got a king. We want a king. And then in 1 Samuel 15, but Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. It's interesting that Saul practiced divination, meaning calling up spirits. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as kings. He's speaking to Saul here. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, I violated the Lord's command and your instructions, I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them, which is kind of a pride. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you, you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. So at this point, he tells him. Now what had happened was, Samuel, as the priest and prophet of God, was the only one who was supposed to offer sacrifice. That was his job. And they were waiting to fight a battle, and waiting and waiting and waiting, and Samuel hadn't shown up yet. And we're going to sacrifice to God before they fought this battle. Well, Saul gets impatient, and so he goes ahead and does the sacrifice himself, which was clearly against God's instructions. He was more concerned about, keeping his men satisfied, not having them give up and go home, and maybe winning the battle, than he was listening to God. And so he violated God's will clearly, and this was the point at which God said, that's enough. I reject you as king. All right? Let's take a break.